Well, we've made it to Lesson 10 of Unit 6, AP European History, Industrialization, and all the other things of the early 19th century. Lesson 9 was about the craziness of France from 1815 to 1848, the two major revolutions that occurred. And today we're going to talk about the ways in which that impacted the rest of Europe and some of the other things that were going on in the rest of Europe. So let's get started. First of all, you may recall the Concert of Europe was this agreement coming out of the Congress of Vienna, 1814 and 1815, where they were all going to keep the peace. The major allies, the four major allies, by working for a balance of power. If revolution started to percolate somewhere, they'd all get together to push it down. They'd make sure no country got too powerful. And we had alluded to the driving force behind all of this being Clemens von Metternich, who's sitting over here to the right. He was the chancellor and foreign minister at various times of the Austrian Empire, and will be them for up until the revolutions of 1848. For over 30 years, he is going to be a driving force in European politics. Deeply, deeply conservative, distrustful of liberals, and distrustful of nationalism. He was probably, of all of the allies, the one who hated nationalism the most, because Austria had the biggest problems with nationalism, as you know, made up of all of those different people groups. The other driving force was probably Alexander I of Russia. He created what he liked to call the Holy Alliance of Prussia, Austria, and Russia. Holy because they were Christian, although different types, Prussia being mostly Protestant, Austria being mostly Catholic, and Russia, of course, being Orthodox. But they were going to get together for the betterment of mankind through good government and conservative government. So working on this balance of power, this conservatism, this system's going to, by and large, work in keeping the peace until the revolutions of 1848. Well, what about Great Britain? Why aren't they, one of the driving forces of this? Well, they exhausted themselves in the Napoleonic Wars. If you recall, there was at one point, it was Great Britain versus pretty much everyone else in Europe. And they didn't see the need to ever do that again. And they won't for about 100 years. Instead, they turned to their massive worldwide empire. They were interested in trading with Europe and making money in Europe, expanding and defending their empire around the world. But as far as they were concerned, the continent could just burn itself down. So they were increasingly disinterested in the continent. Let it do what it wishes. And in fact, we'll find out today why Great Britain ultimately did get in World War I, because they didn't want to be in that. They didn't want a part of that at all. They would have been glad if all the European countries just would have utterly destroyed themselves, except for one. All right, so this does get challenges. There will be lots of challenges between 1815 and 1848, and the first ones are in Spain and Italy. So let's give a little background. Spain, if you recall, had been conquered by Napoleon. Napoleon had put his brother on the throne. The Spanish people hated that dude. They wanted him out. They rose in rebellion against him. There had been a long kind of rebellion, civil war in Spain until ultimately Napoleon was overthrown. The brother was overthrown. And Congress of Vienna, well, what do? We put monarchies back on the throne. Monarchies were seen as the safe bet to keep the order and to keep long-term peace. Machiavelli probably would have agreed. So they restored the monarchy of Ferdinand VII. Put him back on the throne. In doing so, he did promise a constitution to his people and gave him one. His problem is going to be like many of the autocrats of the era. They will promise constitutions or promise liberal reforms, and then what happens? They immediately go back on them. So that's what he does. He dissolves the Cortes, which was the Spanish parliament, and rules without their people's consent. So naturally, rebellion breaks out against the king. The colonies, which had kind of run themselves under the rule of Napoleon's brother, they break out in rebellion against the king. So now he's not only has a rebellion in Spain, but he's going to lose all the colonies. That's a big issue. If they overthrow him or force him to follow a new constitution, then clearly strong monarchies are not going to be the bulwark of stability. In Italy, a very similar thing happened. The king of the two Sicilies, are this bizarre little thing down here. They will also force their king into accepting a liberal constitution and abiding by that. Metternich didn't like either one of these. These were major threats to the status quo. Something had to be done. So what gets done? So he decides to call the super team together and figure out what to do. And at the Congress of Treptow, as these rebellions are breaking out, the Holy Alliance issues what's known as the Protocol of Treptow. Basically, it states that stable governments like Austria and Prussia and Russia have the right to intervene in any country that's having a revolution. So, like in Spain that was happening at that moment, or in Italy, they're having revolutions. These other countries have the right to go in there and break heads. So it's not just the king of your own country. Other countries are going to do that. And they agree, and this was difficult because the countries didn't quite trust each other, but they agreed that they would let Austria intervene in the two Sicilies. So Austria is going to send an army into southern Italy, break some heads, restore the king's power, and put down the rebellion. And, well, who's going to go help Spain? Prussia's too far away. Russia's way too far away. What about France? France is right next door. Now, France had just been the bad country. They'd just been the evil empire, but they went to France and said, hey, would you invade Spain and put down this rebellion and put the king back on the throne? And France said, seriously? Yeah, we'll absolutely do that. And they're like, you can't stay. You don't get to control Spain, but you got to go in there and fix that. And it worked. It surprises me even today when I think about both of these countries intervene in other countries, put down rebellions, restored monarchies, and then they went home. Now, the French army stayed in Spain for a while to support the monarchy, but ultimately, neither country really got anything out of that other than maybe status, or got out of it restoring stability in Europe. But they didn't gain land, they didn't get money. The system was working. They put down these two major rebellions and restored conservative monarchies against liberal rebellions. So good job, Metternich. Doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes things got out of Metternich's control, like in Greece, which was one of these rebellions that kind of surprised everybody. As you recall, it was been under the rule of the Ottomans since the 15th century, since the Byzantine Empire had been overthrown, as the Ottomans came in and overthrew Constantinople. That was it. Russia and Greece had always shared Orthodox religion, so there'd always been, kind of a camaraderie between the two. However, Greece had been able to maintain, because the Ottomans generally allowed religious people to maintain their religious beliefs, had maintained their Greek language and their Orthodox religion, and they'd been able to maintain that Greek identity through hundreds of years of Ottoman rule. But now nationalism is percolating, and the Ottoman Empire is just falling apart. It is the sick man of Europe. It's slowly been retreating. Russia and Austria have both been taking advantage of this. Napoleon tried to take advantage of it when he invaded Egypt. The British are starting to take advantage of it. We talked about the French took Algiers. So everyone's picking off pieces of the Ottoman Empire, and the Greeks are like, wait a minute, we're the place that created Western civilization. We're the ones who are the birthplace of democracy. And the idea of this small group of oppressed people rising up to restore democracy and to restore Western civilization captured Europeans' imagination like none of these other rebellions did. That, if people rebelling in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, English people don't care. But in this case, they did. The English, French, oftentimes poets, people who had this romantic notion, the romantic poets, like we talked about, Lord Byron actually volunteered to go there and died while fighting. Not in the fighting. If I remember, he died of disease. He wasn't in a battle. But he's going to go and give his life for Greek independence. All across Europe, especially in England, there'll be Philhellenic societies, even in the United States. There were organizations gathering money and sending it to the Greek rebellion in order to help them get their victory over the wicked Ottoman Empire. One of the leaders of the rebellion will actually be a Russian general. He was Greek. He was in the Russian army. And the Russians will actually kick him out because the Russians weren't quite sure what to do about this rebellion. His name was Alexander Ypsilanti. That's him over there on the right, carrying the banner of freedom as he crosses a river into Greece. Metternich naturally was like, okay, this is not good because this is right in the Austrian Empire's backyard. The Balkans are all of these, little groups all want their own little country. And if the Greeks get their independence as a nation, then all these other groups in Austria might get the same idea. So he tells the Ottomans, you do that. And many in Russia at first also supports the Ottomans. But as time goes on, Russia sees advantages in an independent Greece. It will weaken Russia, or weaken the Ottoman Empire, and Russia and Greece were already fairly close. So Russia, Great Britain, and France all put pressure on Turkey to stop the war and give Greece measures of independence. Maybe not complete independence, but give it some independence. Turkey refused. They're like, we're going to keep this place. And at this point, there was a military intervention by Russia, Great Britain, and France. They all sent navies down, and they destroyed the Turkish fleet. At the same time, Russia invaded Turkey, realizing, well, Turkey, or Ottoman Empire is busy in Greece. We can take some land, and they did. They'd carved out a bunch of land in Romania and said, "Oh, this is now Russia now." At the end of the day, in 1830, Ottoman Empire could not go on. They'd lost their fleet. The Russians were beating up on them. The Greeks were beating up on them, and they were forced into the Second Treaty of London. And at that point, Greece is declared independent. But how can Metternich save the day? How can conservatives save the day? Well, what if we don't actually allow democracy here? Why don't we let this be a conservative revolution? So what they did is the Allies got together and put a German prince on the throne and created a conservative monarchy to rule the Greeks. So Greece gets its independence, but not really a truly liberal rebellion. It's a nationalistic rebellion. Metternich didn't like it, but there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it, or he'd be at risk of putting the whole Congress, the whole concert of Europe at risk. Greece, however, was not the only nation to gain its independence against prevailing conservative opinions. Belgium will successfully pull off an independence campaign and become an independent part of Europe. And the way it happens is also one of those things where they kind of got lucky, much like the Greeks had. First of all, you may recall, Belgium had been pushed into this Kingdom of Holland in 1850 in the Congress of Vienna in order to create a bulwark against a resurgent France, that it would be strong enough to push back against France, and would not be taken advantage of. Belgium, however, this was not something they really wanted. Belgium was Catholic, and the Netherlands dominated this new government. The Dutch were happy with it because, the king was Dutch. The voting patterns favored the Dutch, so the Dutch controlled the government. The Dutch were basically telling the Belgians what to do, and the Dutch were Protestant. In 1823, there was even an attempt by the Dutch to make Dutch the official language, and we talked about the linkage between nationalism and language. And this is a major insult to the Belgians. And even if you go to Belgium today, much of the area is bilingual. The further west you go, the more French you run into. That was not a successful attempt, but it kind of shows the attitude the Dutch had towards the whole endeavor of the Kingdom of Holland. I mean, it's called the Kingdom of Holland, not of Belgium. So what happens in 1830, again, there's revolutions. And these revolutions in France, every time there's a revolution in France, it sets off revolutions elsewhere. So the revolution in 1830 had set off a Polish revolution. Well, it's also going to set off a Belgian revolution. They're like, oh, wow, look, the French are having a revolution. We should rise up for our independence. We should rise up against our king. And the reason this is lucky for them, Austria at this point was busy crushing Italy, going back down there and crushing a rebellion, because there'll be a rebellion in Italy as well, a nationalistic rebellion trying to push out the Austrians, and the Austrians have to take care of that. Russia is going to be busy crushing Poland, so they have no time or effort to deal with crushing Belgium. Prussia was dealing with its own rebellion which we may get into later. But all three of those major powers were too busy dealing with their own rebellion set off by the whole French Revolution. Then they could not spare the time to deal with it. Meanwhile, France was thrilled. They're like, oh yes, we'd love to see Belgium, because Belgium generally was both pro-British and pro-French. It was more French in its outlook. So the French were hoping, hey, we can dominate this place. And the British wanted an independent Belgium because they felt it would open up trade opportunities. Remember, Belgium's one of the key portions of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, and this would create opportunities for Great Britain to make some more money. So they both kind of wanted this independent Belgium. So with the support of the countries and of course France was going through a revolution themselves. So Great Britain, the only country who could have done something about it, didn't want to do anything about it. And ultimately, by 1831, the Prince Leopold will become the King of Poland and of Belgium, and Belgium will become the Kingdom of Belgium. Several years later, the Convention of 1839 was signed to guarantee Belgian neutrality. that, one, the Belgians were told, hey, you've got to be neutral, but there was more of address to Prussia and France and saying, Belgium is going to be like Switzerland. It's like the Switzerland of the North. No one messes with Belgium. England signed this. This is going to be an issue in 1914 when Germany wants to invade France and they decide to go through Belgium to get there. And the English, who didn't want to be part of World War I, like, no, don't go through Belgium. If you go through Belgium, we're going to have to do something about it. And the Germans are like, are you really going to do something about us invading Belgium? And the English are like, yeah, we got to. And that is the main reason that England gets into World War I. Because remember, England's trying to they don't care about the continent. Let the continent burn itself down. They don't care. It sounds like Brexit. All right, so let's move further east. What about the Ruskies? What are they up to? They're always up to no good, right? Well, Russia came out of the Napoleonic Wars as really the only unconquered continental power. Every other one at some point had been utterly defeated. Russia had at one point been allied because their armies had been defeated, did ally with France, but eventually they broke out of that. Napoleon had taken his best shot at Russia and lost. So Russia comes out of it with new respect by other European powers. They're still a very economically backward country, in terms of freedom for serfs, a very backward country, but a respected country. Alexander I is a big part of that. And Alexander, the Tsar himself was initially fairly liberal. He will promise a liberal constitution to the Poles. He saw the problems in Russia. He wanted to advance education and freedom of expression. However, as time goes on, he sees plots against him, attempted assassinations, and disorder everywhere, and eventually he turns against liberalism, and he becomes much more autocratic, embracing secret police and things like that. And in this quote, I found that he said, liberty should be confined within just limits, and the limits of liberty are the principles of order. And we've talked about this for a couple of units now, this tension between order and liberty. Do you want order or liberty? And the French go back and forth. It seems like every day, like, we want liberty. No, that's too much. We want order. We want an emperor. No, we want a king. No, we want a republic. So he's come down firmly on the side of order, which is what makes him one of the conservatives. That's why he's the architect of the Holy Alliance, that these countries will work together to keep order, because only in order can you have some semblance of liberty, and the order is more important, right? Well, he could not help, however, others from being liberal, and it will ultimately be his army corps, his army officers, who will be the most liberal. They, in being part of the army, they traveled all over Europe. They oftentimes went and visited England to have conferences. They made it to, as you can see, the streets of Paris in 1814, and they came into contact with all kinds of new ideas, enlightenment ideas, and they also saw how Western European cities were far more advanced and far more prosperous than anything that's on Russia. Even the peasants were much more prosperous than the serfs they would see in Russia. So they will start secret organizations to plot against him. There was several plots talking about having a violent revolution against him, but none of those go into effect because he dies unexpectedly without naming an heir. He did not have a son, but he had a couple of brothers. Well, because he didn't name one, and there's going to be this awkward issue of a marriage, it wasn't clear who would become the next czar, which results in what's called the Decembrist Revolt. I found this picture here, the top right of the Decembrists, the 5-part band from, I believe, Seattle, had a minor hit about 7 or 8 years ago. And I believe they're playing Atlanta in August, if there are any concerts in August. Well, anyways, the Decembrists, that's not the real Decembrists, by the way. That's the Decembrists, the band. So he basically, Alexander had 2 brothers, Constantine and Nicholas. Constantine should have been next in line as the younger brother of Alexander. Nicholas was even younger, so he should have been second in line after Constantine. The issue, however, was Constantine had become basically Alexander's regent in Poland. He was ruling over Poland because, remember, the Tsar is the king, but the Tsar usually didn't like going to Poland, so Constantine, his brother, was ruling Poland. And while there, he fell in love with this dashing Polish noble lady, but she was of non-royal blood. And he annulled his previous marriage to a royal and married her instead. Well, marrying a non-royal generally means you don't get to be king. So he'd talked to his brother Alexander before Alexander died and said, I'm going to marry her. I don't want to be czar. I'm kind of happy ruling over Poland. So, and this girl, we were in love. So Constantine, when Alexander dies, Constantine's like, no, I don't want it. Nicholas should have it. Nicholas was like, no, I shouldn't have it. You're the older brother. You're next in line. You should have it. And for about 2 weeks, both of them claimed the other one was the legitimate czar. Well, eventually, Constantine made it clear he couldn't be it. He wasn't giving up his non-royal wife. And Nicholas embarks upon taking the throne. But everyone else was supporting Constantine. They liked Constantine. The Poles liked Constantine. The army officers felt maybe Constantine was more liberal because Constantine, he was a Russian, but he'd married a Pole. He seemed to be allowing the Poles a voice in their own government. So they open in rebellion. This is called the December Revolt. They openly rebel against Nicholas in hopes of bringing Constantine to the throne. Constantine kind of declares neutrality and steps back. Ultimately what happens is Nicholas will have to send in the troops, crush the rebellion, and become Nicholas the First, whereas Constantine will remain as ruler of Poland. Nicholas will end up embracing conservatism fully. That he didn't even flirt with liberalism like his older brother Alexander had, or even Constantine did in Poland. I mean, liberals did literally try to kill him. You can kind of understand why he was fearful of liberal ideals. He became deeply fearful of any type of change. Even though he knew change was necessary, he felt like unleashing that change was extraordinarily dangerous. He had secret police. He brought in censorship. His only main achievement is he kind of put into stone a codification of Russian law in 1833. But ultimately he embraces, here's my recipe for order. Here's my equation. We're going to embrace the Orthodox religion. Orthodox religion will be Russia. We will have an autocratic government. Everyone does what I said, and we'll embrace Russian nationalism. And those three things became kind of the pillars of what is Russia. And all of that will be pushed in the classroom by his Minister of Education. Well, what about Poland? Well, Poland, as you recall, end of Congress of Vienna, they'd created the small little kingdom of Poland, but the Russian Tsar was the king of Poland. So it was really kind of this quasi part of Russia, at the very least controlled by Russia. Alexander, remember when he was flirting with liberalism, had given Poland a fairly liberal constitution. His brother Constantine came in, ruled as regent, as a fairly liberal leader. He got pretty close with the Poles. I mean, he dumped his first wife and married a Pole. He got really close with them. But the Poles wanted more independence. And as time went on, Constantine was, because Nicholas was pushing them to, Constantine was pushing Poles out of office and instead bringing in Russians to do things and doing what Nicholas wanted him to do. Well, then revolutions break out in 1830 in France, in Belgium, and they get inspired, like, we need our own rebellion, we need our own independence. So students and soldiers in Warsaw rise up against the wicked Nicholas, and not Constantine, because they felt like Constantine maybe was okay. They deposed Nicholas. I think their plan was that Constantine would be their king of Poland. They quote, deposed Nicholas. Constantine steps back again. He's like, okay, I don't really know what to do here. Nicholas comes in with the army, crushes the Poles, and it becomes one of the big failed rebellions, in part just because they just didn't have widespread support, and there happened to be a conservative neighbor next door who could do something about it. So Poland will fail as a rebellion for independence. When we come back for the next lesson, we'll talk about some other countries, like what's going on in England. How come they don't have these rebellions? How come they don't have these major problems? And we'll find out the strategies that the English used to make sure they didn't have these problems. Thank you. We'll see you again later.